USS St. Louis, or Lucky Lou, entered service just prior to the start of World War II and saw extensive action throughout the Pacific theater. Although not as famous in the press as her sister Helena, St. Louis battled the Japanese fiercely from the opening minutes of the war until the end of hostilities. Designated CL-49, she was as tough and dependable of a cruiser as there was in the Pacific, and she earned 11 battle stars along the way for her service. The St. Louis class was not a subclass of the Brooklyn class as some believe, as clear distinctions can be made between the two designs. The U.S. Navy, for their part, designated them as a different class altogether from the Brooklyn class, and while the St. Louis class did appear somewhat similar to the Brooklyn class on the outside, they had a similar hull, the same main battery, and similar armor protection. There were major differences between them in internal machinery, secondary armament, and survivability measures. St. Louis and her sister Helena had a dedicated secondary battery, which the Brooklyns did not have, at least until Savannah was upgraded while being repaired in late 1943 and early 1944. The location of the aft superstructure also set them apart, as it was just aft of the second stack on the St. Louis and Helena, but further back and closer to turret number 4 on the Brooklyns. But it was under the waterline where the real dramatic differences between the classes occurred. The St. Louis class was designed with new, higher-pressure boilers that were installed in an alternating arrangement of boiler rooms and engine rooms to prevent the ships from being completely immobilized by a single hit. In previous U.S. designs, the boiler rooms were placed ahead of the engine spaces, which was done to save space and weight, but could be a real problem if the ship took a major hit in that location, and all of their boilers were rendered inoperable. In the end, the St. Louis class consisted of only 2 ships, St. Louis and Helena, as the Navy shifted its focus to designing the Cleveland class with war imminent and the end of the treaty system limitations in sight. The keel of St. Louis was laid down on December 10, 1936, at the Newport News Shipbuilding Company in Newport News, Virginia, and she was launched in mid-April of 1938. She had an overall length of 608 feet and a beam just under 62 feet, with a standard displacement of 10,000 tons. St. Louis had a main battery of 15 6-inch 47 caliber Mark 16 guns housed in 5 triple turrets, 3 forward and 2 aft. Her main battery guns had to be elevated together, as they were on single sleeves, but delay coils permitted individual barrels to be fired, allowing St. Louis to fire either coordinated salvos or rapid fire by individual guns. The hallmark of the St. Louis design was the same as the preceding Brooklyns, the ability to throw copious amounts of gunfire downrange in a very short amount of time, thereby overwhelming the enemy. The 6-inch Mark 16 gun had an incredible rate of fire of 8 to 10 rounds per minute per barrel, based on tests conducted by the cruisers Savannah and Honolulu in March 1939 off Guantanamo Bay. As elevation increased, though, the rate of fire did lower, but it was still more than enough to smother and overwhelm an enemy ship. U.S. naval architects believed this high rate of fire would allow these ships to overpower heavy cruisers armed with 8-inch guns, which lacked the same rate of fire for various reasons. St. Louis's design addressed one of the main deficiencies of the Brooklyn class, the lack of a dedicated secondary battery with punching power. This was addressed by adding 8 of the versatile 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, which were mounted in twin turrets, 1 mount on each side of the conning tower, and 1 mount on both sides of the aft superstructure. These were deployed in anti-aircraft, anti-surface, and shore bombardment roles, and were extremely effective weapons. At the time of her commissioning, St. Louis's light anti-aircraft battery consisted of 850 caliber Browning machine guns. By 1945, she carried 4 quad and 6 twin mounts of Bofors, 40mm guns, and 18 single-mount 20mm Oerlikon autocannons. St. Louis had a main armor belt that was 5 inches thick, 2 inches of deck armor and 6 inches protecting her turrets and barbettes. She was powered by 4 geared turbines, each driving 1 shaft and using the steam provided by 8 oil-fired boilers. Rated for 100,000 shaft horsepower, she was capable of 32.5 knots and had a range of 10,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. St. Louis was commissioned into the fleet on May 19, 1939, and her pre-war service consisted of pretty standard stuff, with her shakedown period ending in early October 1939, followed by neutrality patrols off the East Coast. In November 1940, she was reassigned to the Pacific Fleet and operated out of Pearl Harbor during 1941. On December 7, 1941, St. Louis was tied up at her usual spot in the southeast lock of Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked. Within minutes of spotting the first enemy planes, the ship was at general quarters, and her anti-aircraft guns were going to work on the attackers. By 8:06, the boilers were lit, and all preparations for getting underway had begun. At 8:20, one of her gun crews shot down an enemy torpedo plane. By 9 o'clock, 2 more enemy aircraft had joined the first. Then at 9:31, St. Louis slipped away from her pier and headed for the South Channel and the open sea. She was the first ship to make it out. 15 minutes later, her 6-inch guns, whose power leads had been disconnected, were in full operating order and ready to find the enemy. It was nothing short of remarkable that her crew was able to put up an effective defense within minutes of the start of the attack and get the ship underway and out of the harbor as quickly as they did, as they were much safer in open water cruising at 30 knots with the ability to maneuver then as a sitting duck moor to the pier. She then joined up with the cruisers Detroit and Phoenix to search for the Japanese strike force. This search was unsuccessful, and she spent the rest of the month escorting convoys between Hawaii and California. St. Louis was assigned to Task Force 17 in early January, which was built around the aircraft carrier Yorktown. She was screening for the carrier as the task force conducted the first American airstrikes of the war in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands in early February. By mid-February, she had resumed convoy escort duty, and this would be her role until late May, when she moved north to reinforce the Aleutian Islands. On May 31st, she arrived in Kodiak to patrol the area south of the Alaskan Peninsula for Japanese shipping. She continued patrolling through July, ranging westward to intercept any enemy shipping that was spotted. On August 7th, she participated in her first shore bombardment of the war at Kiska Island, and then covered the occupation of Adak Island in September. St. Louis was sent to Mare Island in late October for an overhaul, which lasted until December. After her overhaul was completed, St. Louis was sent south to join the fight in the Solomons. Here, as a part of a cruiser-destroyer task force, she patrolled the slot and shelled Japanese installations over the next 6 months. Her task force bombarded several Japanese positions on New Georgia from the Kula Gulf during the early morning hours of July 5th to cover U.S. landings there. They would be back again in the Kula Gulf the next night, in an effort to thwart the Tokyo Express, after reconnaissance aircraft had spotted the Japanese departing from Bougainville to attempt the planned reinforcement run that St. Louis and her friends had inadvertently disrupted the night before with their bombardment. St. Louis and the rest of the U.S. task force entered Kula Gulf just after midnight on the 6th, and they were spotted on radar by the Japanese destroyer Nizuki. The Japanese were already unloading soldiers and supplies. U.S. radars finally spotted the Japanese just after 1:30, and they immediately arranged themselves into a battle formation and closed. Just before 2 a.m., the order was given and the U.S. ships opened up. St. Louis, joined by her sister Helena and cousin Honolulu, showed once again on this night why the light cruisers of the Brooklyn and St. Louis classes were referred to by the Japanese as machine gun cruisers. These 3 ships together fired close to 1,500 shells from their 6-inch batteries in a span of just 5 minutes to open the fight. Nizuki took the brunt of the assault and sank quickly as the other Japanese ships disengaged and fled to the northwest. However, just before doing this, they fired a spread of long lance torpedoes, 3 of which struck Helena on her port side, inflicting serious damage, and she sank in about 6 minutes. St. Louis and Honolulu then engaged a second group of Japanese destroyers, the ones that had been landing the reinforcements on the beach, and scored several hits before they too disengaged and fled to the northwest. It was all over by 2:30, and St. Louis retired low on fuel and ammunition after 2 nights of fighting with no damage or casualties reported. St. Louis and her task force resumed patrolling the slot in the days after the Battle of Kula Gulf and encountered the Tokyo Express once again in the early morning hours of July 13th. At 1 a.m., Honolulu's radar picked up the Japanese still in the slot near the entrance to Kula Gulf. The Battle of Kolombangara was about to commence as U.S. destroyers launched a torpedo attack, while the cruisers waited for the enemy to come within 10,000 yards, where their radar-aided fire control would allow them to smother the Japanese with their main batteries. Once in the range they desired, the U.S. cruisers opened up on the lead ship of the Japanese formation with the rapid fire of their 6-inch guns, firing over 2,600 rounds of 6-inch shells in about 10 minutes. She sank quickly after being struck by American torpedoes, which, in a stroke of luck, actually detonated. The rest of the Japanese formation once again fled to the northwest to regroup. Confusion broke out among the U.S. force due to communication problems as they attempted to chase their fleeing enemy. The Japanese were not fleeing, though. They were reloading their long lances for another run. The Americans at this point still did not fully comprehend the true extent of Japanese torpedo capability, or that they were capable of reloading their torpedoes while underway. Just after 2 a.m., the U.S. cruisers were ordered to illuminate the radar blips on the screens in their combat information centers. As the star shells were lofted skyward by the cruisers, the second round of long lances were already barreling towards the U.S. formation. The star shells confirmed that the contacts were in fact Japanese, but before St. Louis could open up, she was struck by a torpedo well forward of Turret 1. Honolulu took a torpedo forward as well, and the destroyer Gwyn received a fatal hit amidships. As the Japanese continued on into the night, St. Louis and her mates retired to Tulagi with light casualties on both cruisers, owing to the location of the torpedo strikes, which were both well forward of any battle stations and concentrations of men. Gwyn lost 61 men during her sinking. The damage from the torpedo strike sent St. Louis stateside to the Mare Island Navy Yard for repairs and an overhaul. She was back in the Solomons by mid-November, where she provided fire support and conducted shore bombardments in the vicinity of Bougainville and the Shortland Islands into early 1944. On February 14th, while supporting operations to take the Green Islands, St. Louis came under air attack and was struck by a bomb that penetrated the 40mm clipping room near the No. 6 mount and exploded in the midship living compartment beneath it. 23 sailors were killed and 20 more were wounded, 10 of them seriously. Both of her planes were rendered inoperable and her ventilation system was damaged. Communication with the aft engine room was cut and the cruiser slowed to 18 knots. The next day, she survived another air attack before being ordered back to Purvis Bay for repairs. These were completed by early March, and she resumed her operations in the Solomons, which would last until the end of May. In June, St. Louis moved on from the Solomons and into the Central Pacific as she commenced her participation in the Marianas campaign. Here, she helped soften up Saipan and Guam prior to the Marines hitting the beaches on both islands, then provided fire support until being dispatched in late July for an overhaul. In mid-November, St. Louis rejoined the fleet at Leyte Gulf and was immediately thrusted into action covering shipping in the area from air attacks. On November 27th, she came face-to-face with the new emerging threat to the fleet, the kamikaze. Just before noon, a Japanese Val made a dive on St. Louis from the port quarter and exploded with its bomb on impact. Fires broke out in the hangar area, and all of the sailors working the nearby 20mm guns were killed or wounded. A second attacker headed at her on the port beam. Flank speed was rung up, and the rudder was put hard right as the plane passed over turret number 4 and crashed violently into the sea. 2 more attackers then swooped down on St. Louis. The first was splashed off the port quarter, while the second dove in from starboard and crashed into her port side. A 20-foot section of armor belt was lost, and numerous holes were torn in her hull by the strike, and soon she was listing to port. As damage control parties got to work, St. Louis splashed another attacker and evaded a torpedo attack. By 12:36, about an hour after the attack began, she was back sitting on an even keel, and her fires had been mostly suppressed. Her casualties amount to 15 dead, 1 missing, and 43 wounded. The next day she transferred her wounded and made her way to San Pedro Bay for temporary repairs before heading to the west coast for permanent repairs. Her repairs were completed by March 1, 1945, and she joined the Fast Carrier Task Force by the middle of the month. Here, she was assigned to Task Force 58.4, which was centered around the fleet carriers Yorktown and Intrepid, along with the battleships New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin. St. Louis screened the carriers as they struck targets in the southern Japanese home islands in late March, then withstood a barrage of brutal kamikaze attacks that damaged both Yorktown and Intrepid. In late March, St. Louis was dispatched to participate in the invasion of Okinawa. She guarded minesweepers and underwater demolition teams as they cleared the channels to the assault beaches, then participated in the pre-invasion shore bombardment. Afterwards, she stayed on station until mid-May, providing fire support to the troops ashore, before heading to Leyte for some rest. In mid-June, she resumed support activities off Okinawa before being shifted in mid-July to Task Force 95, which began conducting airstrikes against Japanese installations on the Asian mainland and sweeps of the East China Sea for Japanese shipping. In early August, she dropped anchor in Buckner Bay, and she remained there through the end of hostilities on the 15th of August. Post-war duties kept St. Louis in the Far East for another 2 months before she joined the Operation Magic Carpet Fleet, completing 3 voyages by the end of January 1946. In early February, she set sail for the East Coast and arrived in Philadelphia for inactivation on the 25th. She was decommissioned in June and berthed at League Island with the Reserve Fleet until the early 1950s, when she was designated for transfer to the government of Brazil. She was struck from the Naval Vessel Register in January 1951, and by the end of that month she was commissioned in the Brazilian Navy. She served with the Brazilian Navy until 1976, when she was decommissioned and sold for scrap. While being towed to Taiwan for scrapping, she foundered and sank off the coast of South Africa. The Lucky Lou and the men that manned her served their country with honor and distinction. She was a tough ship that always brought her crew home no matter the circumstances. She had a short but action-packed career with the U.S. Navy, helping to achieve final victory in the Pacific, then avoided the scrapper and had a nice second career in the South Atlantic. In the end, she was a stubborn old gal and went down on her own terms rather than face the breakers. Thank you for watching. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe so that we can bring you more content just like this.